Hello, historians. It's me again, the tiny little talking head down in the bottom left corner here. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the origins of the Cold War. Now, obviously, this is in supplemental to the stuff that's already in the textbooks and the other various assigned readings for the course. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a few aspects of the early years of the Cold War, which hopefully will help to explain why this thing came into being in the aftermath of World War II. World War II, of course, I mean, the storyline of World War II had been, the Americans allied with the Soviet Union, allied with the British and the remaining Free French forces and all of that, all of us joining together to fight against the evils of fascism, and this combined alliance successfully defeated fascism in the form of Nazi Germany. And then suddenly, within a couple of years, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, wartime allies, again, are at each other's throats. And they're both kind of struggling for control of history, control of the future, to control the way the world develops after the war. So, I'm going to focus on a couple of specific contexts here today. The ideological context, where I'm going to talk about communism versus capitalism and what that means. The historical context, which is kind of the long-running history of the United States and the Soviet Union, how they interacted during World War II, but also before and after World War II. And then the rhetorical context, which is basically leaders on both sides start making a bunch of talking points, which are going to define the Cold War. And then I'm going to end by talking about how the U.S. policy of containment led to kind of this permanent military footing that the U.S. existed in throughout the entire Cold War, which is very different from anything the U.S. had encountered before World War II. Okay, so to get us started here, the ideological context. This is important because we talk about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and what we're really talking about, though, are worldviews. Worldviews that are informed by politics, worldviews that are informed by the desire for control, the desire for political power, the desire for geopolitical power, the desire for diplomatic power. But at the root of the U.S. versus Soviet Union conflict during the Cold War is a difference in ideology. And I want to spend a minute here just kind of defining the various ideologies, because over the rest of the course, I'm going to be throwing around words like capitalism and communism and Soviet communism versus other types of communism. And so what I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands what these terms mean. So first off, let's start with capitalism. This is the one with which probably everybody in this class is the most familiar. American-style capitalism, which is where we have a society that includes different economic classes. You've got a working class, a middle class, an upper class, the wealthy, whatever you want to call it. But there are different classes and each class has different levels of wealth, different levels of political power, different levels of economic power. But there are different classes, and everybody recognizes that there are classes in it. Americans, we like to talk about, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and that, Americans, any poor American can become rich, and vice versa. Yeah, that's true, but that implies and recognizes that we do have classes in this country. And we might like to downplay it because we may not like to talk about differences between Americans, because that leads to political conflict and all that. But the fact remains, there are classes in the United States. There are political parties in the United States, obviously. Democrats, Republicans, whatever. There's a sense of nationalism in the United States where we have a sense that there is a concrete territorial and political entity known as the United States. It has boundaries. And within those boundaries, we emphasize Americans' commonality, and a lot of people also talk about American greatness. And so nationalism leads to a sense that there is a nation, and that there is a whole world outside of the nation. There's us, and then there's the world. Sometimes it's phrased as us versus the world, but not always. But there is a sense there is a nation and a world, and those are two different concepts. But One thing that Americans pride themselves on ever since the very beginning is the idea that we are ruled by a set of laws and not by a person or a personality or a core group of people. We're not an oligarchy, you know. You can talk about how that's played out over the years, but the system under which the American Constitution is built on this idea of the rule of law. That's what Thomas Paine said way back when he was writing Common Sense to get people all fired up for independence from Great Britain, is that this new nation is going to be built on the rule of law and not the arbitrary whim of a king or a tyrant or a monarch. That's the problem with monarchs. They are arbitrary. They can decide one day that, I want this to be the rule. And then the next day they might say, nah, screw that. I'm going to go do I want a different rule to take effect. That's arbitrary. You can't make plans. You can't have expectations. Under this new nation, as Thomas Paine saw it, and as we Americans have seen it ever since, we like the idea that we are governed by a rule of laws, which creates consistency. It creates the ability to make expectations for the future. We're not subjected to the arbitrary whims of a monarch. We have private ownership of economic functions, businesses. There is private ownership, meaning that, someone owns it. It's not the people that owns it. That also means that those entities are not designed to help the people. They're meant to help the owner. That's what businesses are for, right? Is to make business for the business owner. Businesses usually aren't there for the good of the people. They're usually there for the owners or the stockholders or whatever, or the employees, whatever you want to call it. And that's fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But that's the way it works under American-style capitalism. Private ownership. But the idea is that people are rational in the United States, and even though everything is privately owned, there is going to be an inherent recognition among Americans that you do have to do some things for the good of people, or else people aren't going to buy your stuff. And so self-interest is going to force Americans to cooperate with each other. Because if you don't cooperate, you're not going to get what you want. So if you as a business owner don't care about your customers' wishes, eventually you're not going to have any customers. And so rationality, a rational business owner, will take the whims or the feelings of the public into account when they're formulating their business practices and all of that. Overall, though, in the United States, we live in a fairly decentralized society. It's a republic, after all, a federal republic, where you've got states and the national government. In our system, you've got states developing rules, and you've got federal government developing rules, but it's not always centralized under a national government. Under the U.S. Constitution, there are certain things that fall under federal control, national control, but everything outside of that kind of delineated stuff in the Constitution falls to the states. So it's kind of decentralized. But there are rules in place. The state and national governments do create rules, formal and informal regulation, to make sure businesses play ball, that everybody is treated well, that kind of thing. So that's the American-style capitalism. Hopefully that makes sense. Now I'm going to move on to communism. And communism, it's a little bit tricky, because the communism that exists on paper has never actually become reality in the real world. And so communism as it exists in the world is very, very different from communism as it existed on paper. And this is going to be important. So that's why I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about it. This second section here on communism, this is the idealized paper version of communism that people like Karl Marx and Engels and all of them kind of put together back in the 19th century. And under this idealized version of communism, we would have a new we'd have a new government. A government where there is no class. Because class is the source of conflict in a society. Rich versus poor. Middle class versus rich. Whatever. I mean, we see this kind of type of rhetoric play out in the United States today. There are class conflicts. And so communism is going to come about once class conflict no longer exists because classes have been eradicated. And so everybody's going to be the same economic class. There will not be there's no need for money Because everybody owns everything. Common ownership of the means of production here. That's what I'm saying. Everybody benefits from the factories and the farms, so everybody just gets to use the products of the farms and the factories. You don't need money because you don't have to buy anything, because everything is available to everybody. So there's no classes, there's no money, there are no political parties under the idealized version of communism. Everybody gets along, everybody cooperates out of a sense of wanting to help everybody else. Everybody, for the good of the community outweighs the good of the person. And under this idealized form of communism, everybody that is a member of that community embraces that ideology. That what is good for the community is better than what's good for me, the individual. And also under communism, there is no nation, because everybody is unified, which means it's a universal theory, which means the entire world should be a part of this. Because you can't have classes if there are no boundaries. I mean, or vice versa. You can't have boundaries and still have no classes. You can't have borders, which means that communism, the idealized version of communism, is truly a global phenomenon where everybody participates around the world. You can't have it in just one country. It's not possible that way. So again, common ownership of the means of production. Workers are kind of the heroes of this system, because everybody's a worker. You've got factory workers, farm workers. Everybody is a worker. Everybody is equal, and so therefore workers are the ideal actor in these communist cultures, communist societies, whatever you want to call it. It's also a very decentralized society with very informal regulation, because again, everybody is voluntarily working together for the betterment of all mankind, for the betterment of the community, not themselves. So you don't really need rules. If everybody is working together, you don't need rules. You might have, the local committee, might have a rule about not speeding or something, I don't know, but there's not going to be anywhere near the massive collection of laws that you see in capitalist societies. Laws hold people back. Under communism, you don't need laws because everybody is going to voluntarily work together for the betterment of the entire society. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, as you can tell, that's a very idealized version of communism. It doesn't work in the real world because, of course, there are boundaries. And if you've got a country with a boundary, you have to have an army to police that boundary. And if you have an army, then you have to raise funds, and that means taxes. And you have to have a government that administers that army, which means you're going to have the creation of political parties and political functionaries. Under the true version of communism, the paper version of communism, there is no government. There's no government at all because everybody works together. However, that doesn't work out in the real world. And so what happens in the real world is we end up with Soviet-style communism, which is where you've got classes, because as soon as you have a government in place that makes decisions on when to use the military, how to use taxes, that kind of thing, that creates classes right there. You've got a ruling class, and then a non-ruling class, and then eventually that fractions even more. You might try to limit the government's, power or whatever by limiting it to one party, but that opens the door to all kinds of new forms of corruption and everything. Because you have borders, because there are non-communist countries out there, that means you have a sense of nationalism. You have a sense of us versus the world. Soviet Union knows that there are capitalist countries on its doorstep off to the far west and then across the Pacific in the United States. They know there are non-communist countries out there. And so that means that it's not a truly universal concept. It's a national concept. And so a sense of nationalism arises within the Soviet Union, which really shouldn't be there under the paper form of capitalism, or communism, sorry. And then, of course, like I said before, the United States being under the rule of law rather than the arbitrary whims of a dictator. That, of course, doesn't happen in the Soviet Union. When you have the development of classes and you have the developments of parties, you naturally end up with individual leaders of the party and the various ruling classes, and that guy is going to be in charge, which is the antithesis of communism. Communism should never, under a communist system, nothing should ever rely on one person. It should only be the group. But under the system that develops in the Soviet Union, of course, it all develops on largely one guy, Joseph Lenin at first, and then not Joseph Lenin, sorry, Vladimir Lenin, and then Joseph Stalin is the one I was thinking of. Stalin becomes the personality, especially in the early years of the Cold War. Under the Soviet-style communism, you've got that ruling class, and that ruling class directs everything. They own all the factories, all the farms. The people don't own it, the state owns it. And the state, meaning that ruling class, owns it. And you've got an exploitation of workers in this command economy. The command economy in the Soviet Union is going to tell people where they go to work. You will be a factory worker. You will be a farm worker. May not even matter what your skills are. You have been assigned to that job. That's what you're going to do under this system. So you've got a very, very powerful centralized state with a whole lot of formal regulation, because they have to keep this system operating. They have to do it while pretending to be communist, when in reality they're not really much like the ideal form of communism. So in this conflict that we have going in the Cold War, we've got American-style capitalism versus Soviet-style communism. Some people call the Soviet-style communism state capitalism because it kind of turns out there are a lot of similarities. We tend to think that, American-style capitalism is completely antithetical to Soviet-style communism. Well, kind of, but there are also a lot of similarities between the two. One is that both of them have classes, like it or not. Political parties exist. In the Soviet Union, sure, okay, it's one party, but there are still political parties that exert influence and control over the political process. Both sides have a sense of nationalism. The Americans have this sense of what it means to be an American and what the United States is and what it stands for. Residents of the Soviet Union also have the same thing. They have a sense of what it means to be a Soviet citizen, and what the Soviet Union is there for, what it is and what it does. Difference in the rule of who's in charge. In the U.S., supposedly, we've got this body of law that's in charge, while the Soviet Union, the cult of personality. Private ownership of the means of production in American-style capitalism versus state ownership of production in Soviet-style communism. So there are obviously some differences in the way people are treated, differences in the ownership of property. The United States, as I mentioned before, has that federal republic, so we've got kind of layers of decentralized government. In the Soviet Union, you've got a very powerful centralized state with formal regulation, whereas in the U.S., you've got kind of a mix of formal and informal regulation. So these are the two ideologies at play throughout the Cold War. This is a very simplified version, obviously. I don't want to spend 12 hours recording a video talking about the various subtleties of all these different isms, but hopefully that gives you kind of a brief little introduction to how these two ideologies work, how they work together, what they have in common, and where they are different. Because this is going to be important. As we talk about the Cold War for the next few weeks, it's going to be very important to understand these various isms and how they compare and how they contrast. Okay. So let's talk about how the ideological conflict developed into where did it come from? What was the history of the relationship of these two? Now, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had been involved with each other pretty much all the way back to the very beginning of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution in 1917, of course, overthrew the autocratic regime of the Tsar of Russia. And the communist triumph over the Europe-friendly Tsar family sent a bit of a shock and panic through the rest of the world. Of course, Western Europe, had been relying on the Soviet Union Russia, as an ally during World War I. The Russians had kept the Germans kind of bottled up on the Eastern Front, which had lessened the pressure on those Western powers fighting in the war, especially France, Britain, and the U.S. When the Russian government fell and the new Soviet government withdrew from World War I, the Germans were able to kind of shift all their troops back to the Western Front, which caused a lot of heartburn for those Western forces. But the fall of Russia to a communist revolution was terrifying even outside of that World War I context, because there's these ideological problems. And that, when I talked about that that paper version of communism, where should be a worldwide phenomenon, that scared a lot of people who didn't want to be communist. The idea was there from the very beginning that communism is expansionistic and it will spread. And eventually the ultimate goal is to take over the world and make the entire world communist. And so that is a realistic fear that Western powers had, that anti-communist powers had. And so there were a lot of attempts by Western powers, including the United States, to interfere with that Russian Revolution back in 1917. Americans actually landed troops in Vladivostok on the eastern coast of the Soviet Union in 1917 to try to disrupt various supply routes and all of that to the revolutionaries. Obviously, they were unsuccessful because the revolution succeeded, and that created a little bit of bitterness between this brand new Soviet government and the United States, because the U.S. had interfered in the revolution. That wasn't cool, and so the Soviets are going to bear a bit of a grudge towards the United States afterwards. So World War I was kind of the start of this kind of suspicion and hostility between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. After World War I, the Soviet Union created this Communist International Organization, which was designed to help bring about that universal communist revolution that would kind of hopefully instate that paper version of communism. The Communist International, they started meeting in 1919, as we're talking about here, but this group, this attempt to create a worldwide organization that would lead the fight against capitalism and strive for the triumph of communism, immediately fell into factional fighting, because everybody thought that their vision of communism was the correct one. And so, Lenin had his vision of communism, and he thought his was the correct one. Stalin had a slightly different version of his communism in his head, and he believed his was the right one. And everybody kind of had their own vision of what communism was. And so, and not many of them agreed with each other. And this is going to be very important later on, because, when you get to the 50s and you've got Chinese communists, the Chinese vision of communism is very different from the Soviet Union's version of communism. And as we're going to see in the 1960s, Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, are actually going to go to war with each other over the definition of communism and over the ideological differences between the two. It wasn't a very big war. It didn't end in a Holocaust or anything. So we rarely hear about it today, but there actually was warfare between the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists over what is the true definition of communism. And that's the problem that plagued communism all the way back to the beginning. They disagreed with each other on what communism actually is, how it works, and what their goals are. Now, this is something that the U.S. and Western powers are going to be very bad at acknowledging. The Americans, we tend to look at communism as this monolithic force that is unified, that knows what it wants. It wants the destruction of Western-style capitalism. That's what we think anyway, but that's not true. Communists disagreed amongst themselves all the time, which is one of the reasons the Communist International was never a very influential organization. It never sparked the communist uprising that it was charged with sparking, because they kept fighting amongst themselves. And that's what I'm talking about here with the inter and intra. Communists disagreed amongst themselves, and of course they also fought against capitalism and all that too. So communists were divided, and their energies were directed in many different directions. Okay, so then we get to World War II. And the two sides, the Americans and the Soviets, were kind of forced together in opposition to what they believed was kind of the larger threat at the time, which was fascist Germany under the Nazis. And so the Soviet Union, of course, got into it before anybody else, really, because Hitler made the foolish decision of invading Poland, which sparked war with the Soviet Union. So the Soviets came in 1940. The Great Britain came in fairly soon thereafter. And the Soviets and the British immediately started calling to the U.S. for help. Now, remember, the Soviets had been a bit suspicious of the Americans, but they still recognized that the Americans are probably anti-fascist. And so the Americans certainly are not going to be pro-communist, but the anti-fascist is going to outweigh the pro-communist. And so the Americans are kind of dancing around. FDR The American president wants to get involved in the effort against the effort against Germany, before 1941, before Pearl Harbor. But there are a whole bunch of neutrality laws in place. Congress isn't going to play along. So FDR is not really able to get involved like he wants to. The Soviets keep calling on the U.S. to get involved, and the British keep calling on the U.S. to get involved, but we keep dragging our feet from the perspective of those other powers. Pearl Harbor, of course, changes the calculus. The U.S. gets involved, goes to war against Japan. Japan had formed an alliance with Germany, a Japanese alliance with white supremacists. That really wasn't a very good idea, but Germany declares war on the U.S. because of the American war against Japan. So, the Americans are now involved in the war. Moscow and London both breathe a sigh of relief, thinking, okay, finally the Americans are here, they're going to help us. The Americans decide to take their time. The Americans start nibbling around the edges. The Soviets expect the Americans to immediately land troops on the western coast of France. They basically expect D-Day to come in 1941, but the Americans don't do that. Instead, the Americans spend the first couple of years kind of nibbling around the edges in northern Africa, going up into Italy, kind of in the Middle East. The Americans, from the Soviet perspective, are wasting a whole lot of time. And the Americans spend the first 3 years of war in the Eastern theater, the European theater, basically nibbling around the edges and not actually getting involved. The Soviets desperately want the Americans to land in France to relieve the pressure of all this fighting that's happening in Western Russia. The Americans don't do that, and that's really very frustrating for the Soviets. Well, for all the Allies, but especially for the Soviets, because the Soviets are dying, by the hundreds of thousands a day. The Soviets lost more people during World War II than any other country in the world. The Soviets are losing people and property and all that in numbers that we can't even fathom. So they're getting a little bit ticked off as time goes on. They keep screaming to FBR, please help us, please land on the Western Front so that we can relieve our forces. And the Americans just don't do it. And then while that's happening, we've got statements coming out of the U.S. that kind of poison the well a little bit. For example, this one from Senator Harry S. Truman, who said during, in an interview with the New York Times in 1941, this before Pearl Harbor, so the U.S. isn't involved at this point, but, looking ahead, thinking that, yeah, we probably will get involved at some point, because by 41, everybody figured that somehow, some way, we're probably going to get involved. But Truman says, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. This became known as the let them bleed statement. And now, granted, Truman at this time was only he was a senator from Missouri. He was not necessarily a decision maker in military matters, but from the perspective of the Soviet Union, wow, that's kind of a nasty statement. Let them bleed each other for a while, and then we can walk in and knock the other side out. Excuse me. So the Soviets are not happy with this. And they're not going to be happy in 1944 when Harry S. Truman becomes FDR's running mate. And when FDR wins the 1944 presidential election, Harry S. Truman is now the vice president of the United States. The vice president is not, it's not a major player. It's kind of a placeholder type office, but the Soviets don't always know that. And so from the Soviet perspective, the second in command of the United States is the guy who a couple years earlier said that you should just let them bleed each other for a while. Let the Soviets bleed, let the Germans bleed, and then we'll walk in and pick up, knock everyone down and pick up the pieces afterwards. So the Soviets are a bit suspicious of the United States, which doesn't, so we've got all the ideological stuff, and now we've got a whole lot of historical baggage happening here also. Then, in February of 45, just before FDR dies, the two sides hold this conference at Yalta where they hammer out what is the post-war world going to look like. February 45, the writing's pretty much on the wall. The war is going to be ending soon. The Allies are going to win this thing. We don't know exactly when or how it's going to play out, but the writing's on the wall. The Germans are not going to be able to pull this off. And so they start thinking about What is the world going to look like once this war is over? And so they start coming up with a bunch of agreements. One is that Eastern Europe, the Soviets have lost so many people and so much property that the rest of the Allies agree that the Soviets need to have a buffer zone in place in case there ever is another similar crisis. I mean, think about it. In the last 20 years, 30 years at this point, Germany had risen up twice and launched massive wars against the rest of the world. So there was a fear that that could happen again. So we're going to we, being the Western powers, are going to allow the Soviets to maintain a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. A lot of people back home are going to accuse FDR of selling out Eastern Europe and handing them over to the godless communists, but that's still to come. One of the other agreements is that we will sever Germany, split it in two. Actually, we're going to split it into 4 groups. Technically, one chunk controlled by Britain, one chunk by France, one chunk by the U.S., the other chunk by the Soviet Union. So we're going to divide Germany up, try to limit the potential for it rising up and becoming a problem yet again at some point in the future. And then we're also going to create a United Nations, which is this effort to create a worldwide body that will come together to solve problems on the conference table rather than on the battlefield. So there's this agreement that we're going to try to approach the post-war world is going to be different when it comes to solving problems. So that's the United Nations, or at least the initial conception of it. So all that stuff is agreed to in February of 45, just before FDR dies. And one of the other things that the Soviets agree to, in exchange for getting, control over Eastern Europe, the Soviets say, all right, well, once the war is over in Europe, we will step in and help the Americans finish off the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. And so there's a 90-day kind of agreement put in place that when the Germans surrender, 90 days from then, the Soviets will shift their forces to the Russians' eastern front to help the Americans fight against the Japanese. The Germans surrender in May of 45. 90 days later would be mid-August. But in the first week of August, the second week of August, August 7th and August 9th, the U.S. drops these 2 new superweapons on the Japanese at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, these new atomic bombs that no one had ever used before, which brings an end to World War II. It brings an end to the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater of World War II. From the Soviet perspective, this is a bit of a slap in the face. They had been thinking that they would get involved in the war against Japan, they would help win the war against Japan, and then they would probably also become beneficiaries of that war. They would probably be able to extract some other concessions from the U.S. Maybe they'd be able to exert a sphere of influence in Eastern Asia. Maybe they'd be able to control part of Japan afterwards. And the U.S., instead of cooperating with the Soviets, decided to light off these atomic bombs, which brought the war to an end. There's all the arguments pro and against the atomic bombings. I'm not going to go into that here, but from the Soviet perspective, this is kind of another slap in the face from the Americans, which is going to help fuel tensions. And there are a lot of people that make the argument that Truman did light these off to intentionally slap down the Soviets, because the Truman and the various military powers did not want the Soviets to get involved, because that would mean the Soviets would benefit and they'd get the spoils of war. That was not a good thing. And so Truman did partially make the decision to drop these bombs as a way to limit Soviet expansion into the Far East. Okay. So that's the wartime experience. Both sides are fighting for the same fight against the Germans, but they're very suspicious afterwards. And there's even some stories about American soldiers at the end of World War II who received the orders that the war is over, but many of them truly and honestly believed that that would soon be followed up by orders to turn around and march toward the Soviet Union. There were a lot of American GIs who believed that war with the Soviets is probably going to be stage 2 of World War II. It never happened, thankfully, but there were a lot of people who believed that was going to happen. Okay, so what really did happen? After the war is over, thankfully in some ways, the war became an ideological and a rhetorical war, for a while anyway, instead of a hot war. This is where we get the term Cold War. In February of '46, Stalin kind of got the ball rolling. Again, he's rather suspicious of the Americans at this point, and he makes this speech where he says that World War II was the inevitable result of the development of world economic and political forces on the basis of modern monopoly capitalism. Capitalism was at fault for the war that just ended. Now remember, the Soviets had lost 20 million people in World War II. This was a hugely traumatic moment for the Soviet people, and he is basically assigning the blame for all of that trauma and all of that tragedy on those Western powers. He's talking about monopoly capitalism in Germany, but it's not that big of a leap to also believe that applies to all the other Western powers too. Germany was a Western power, like it or not, and so the other Western powers can easily get painted with that same brush. So Stalin gives this speech where he basically assigns blame for the war on Western-style capitalism. Not necessarily Germany, it's capitalism that is the enemy here. And that's a big deal. Soon after that, 3 months later in May, Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech at a graduation ceremony in Missouri. It's just what you want to hear at a graduation ceremony, is that the world's about to end. But he talks about how this Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. All those those eastern territories that had been granted to the Soviet Union at the Yalta Conference are now being separated from the free Western powers. And he phrases it as a free versus slave system. He's not talking about a physical wall. There's no physical wall at this point. The Berlin Wall and all that stuff will come later. But there is a ideological wall, or what he's calling an Iron Curtain, that is now dividing East from West in Europe. And that Eastern territory is governed by the iron fist of the Soviet Union. All of those people are enslaved to the Soviet Union. Everybody on the Western side of the Iron Curtain is free. They are, governed benevolently by the enlightened governments of the U.S. and Britain and France. And so there is this, he's employing a lot of the same rhetoric that Stalin was using, talking about how we've now got a good versus evil. And that sets a very dangerous tone. And then we've also got people behind the scenes that are making reports to their respective governments. Nikolai Novikov was a diplomatic official in the Soviet embassy in the United States, and he wrote this long telegram back home to the foreign ministry in the Soviet Union, basically trying to figure out, okay, now that the war is over, what do the Americans want? And his conclusions are that after the war, the Americans want to eradicate communism. They want to destroy the Soviet Union. You've got Harry Truman, the guy who had basically said flat out that he'd like the Soviets to bleed, is now president. And so he's a dangerous guy from the Soviet perspective. He's got nuclear or atomic weapons. He's got the biggest standing army in the world at this point. Everyone else is in tatters. He's got the strongest economy in the world at this point because everybody else's industrial base has been destroyed during the war. The Americans have pretty much are holding all the cards here. And what they want to do is destroy the Soviet Union. And so what the Soviet Union needs to do is defend itself. Prevent the Americans from destroying it. Because they will, if you give them a chance. So, this is the message being sent back home to Moscow from their guy in the United States. Now, the Americans, we had our own guy in the Soviet Union. This guy, George Kennan, was attached to the American embassy in Moscow. And fairly soon after Novikov sent his telegram back home to Moscow, that our guy Kennan sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department, basically doing the same thing, outlining what did the Soviets want, what were their intentions, and what were their capabilities. And their intentions, according to Kennan, was to take over the world and eradicate American-style capitalism. The Soviets want world domination. Even though they just lost millions of people in the war, they still have a huge military presence. We have the atomic bomb, which is great, but they have the sheer numbers of soldiers. They've got a lot more people in uniform than the Americans did. And so the Americans need to recognize that the Soviets are a threat, and the Americans need to do whatever they can to stop the Soviets from becoming any more powerful. And so, in many ways, these two telegrams later on. So the Kennan telegram was in 1946. In the next year, he published a kind of a redacted, unclassified version of that telegram in this article called "The Sources of Soviet Conduct" in the magazine Foreign Affairs, which basically makes the same arguments. You can read either one online, but basically both sides are making kind of the same argument here. The other guy is all powerful, and the other guy wants to destroy us. And the reality, of course, is more complicated. The Soviets didn't have the capability of destroying the United States, even though Kennan said they did. But that's not the point. The point is that this is what people are believing at the time. So the Americans back home fully buy this telegram and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The Soviets back home they received Novikov's telegram. They said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The Americans are bloodthirsty. Or the Soviets are bloodthirsty. Take your pick, whichever side you're on. So, the proper American response, according to George Kennan, is the policy that became known as containment. And containment is this idea where we need to prevent the Soviets from expanding. Because remember, communism is all about expansion. Communism doesn't exist until it is universal. And so there's this constant fear that the Soviets are going to continue to expand until they have the whole world under their thumb. And so the Americans, using George Kennan's guidance, decide to create this policy of containment where we're going to prevent the Soviets from expanding anywhere. And the first manifestation of this containment policy came in 1947 with what was called the Truman Doctrine, where there was a communist insurgency in the countries of Greece and Turkey. The British, who were nominally in charge of Greece and Turkey, after the war, they couldn't afford to handle it, so they basically handed it off to the U.S., saying, hey, if you want to do something there, go do it, it's all you, we're out. Truman responded with a proposal to fund an anti-communist fight in Greece and Turkey. And he phrased it as that I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes, but we cannot allow changes in the status quo by such methods as coercion or political infiltration. So basically what he's saying there is that it is our job and our responsibility as Americans to prevent the expansion of communism into new areas of the globe. We will do this peacefully when we can, but the implication there is that if push comes to shove, we reserve the right to do other things. And so the Truman Doctrine became kind of the initial formulation of the policy of containment, which will then get codified in other ways later on. So we're going to prevent the expansion of communism wherever its ugly head arises. Now, this is a complicated and potentially, heartburny type policy, because that means you're obligating the United States to stamping out communism wherever it pops up. And as we're going to see over the next few weeks, that's going to lead to huge heartburn for the United States. Because communism is going to flare up in places like, Korea, Vietnam, Nicaragua, a lot of places that in order to follow this policy of containment, the U.S. is going to feel obligated to intervene in all these countries around the world to try to put down these potentially communist rebellions. And that's going to lead to tremendous losses in blood and treasure. That's all still to come. But all of that stuff is an outgrowth of this initial idea of containment, that we have the responsibility and the right to stamp out communism wherever it may flare up around the world. And to do that, we're going to put the United States on a permanent war footing. Now, this is new. In previous conflicts, when the war is over, the United States always demobilized. The military would shrink, the military bureaucracy would shrink. After World War II, for the very first time, though, the American military actually expanded a bit. The The portfolio, the powers of the military expanded a bit after the war. We have the creation of the National Security Act in 1947 kind of codified and solidified this expansion of the American military state after the war. You start to see the creation of new organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency over here in the left column here. The idea that we're going to have a permanent peacetime intelligence agency, a permanent peacetime war council, a permanent peacetime munitions board, all of these things are now going to become permanent. Whereas during previous wars, all of these things had been shut down. I mean, they all existed during previous war efforts, but they all got shut down after the war. Now we're going to keep this stuff going because we need to be able to respond militarily to communist expansion anywhere in the world. Sure, under the Truman Doctrine, we're going to try to solve it through money, through economic aid and all of that. But if push comes to shove, we're going to have to use the military at some point to stop communist expansion. And so that became codified in the National Security Act. This became more important, kind of from this new bureaucratic, militarized United States. Very soon, in 1948, the Soviet Union basically invaded Czechoslovakia and overthrew a government there that was leaning a bit too pro-West, and replaced that government with a Soviet-friendly communist government. The Americans saw that as an example of expansion. The Berlin airlift, which came about when the Soviet Union tried to shut down all access in and out of East Berlin. There's those 4 zones in the aftermath of World War II. You've got the British, French, and Americans and the Soviets kind of controlling different zones of Germany. At one point, the Americans, French, and British decided to fuse their sections together, and they asked the Soviets if they wanted to join them, and the Soviets said no. They were already attacked twice in this century by a mobilized, militarized Germany. They didn't want to see it happen again, so the Soviets decided to keep their section separate from the rest of Germany, and so we have Germany get split in half, roughly in half. East Germany and West Germany. West Germany, which is pro-West, the pro-Europe, pro-American, pro-British. And then you've got the East Germany, which of course is pro-Eastern, controlled by the Soviet Union. And then Berlin, the capital city, which is actually in the middle of Soviet territory, was similarly split 4 ways. You've got West Berlin and East Berlin, once all the 3 western sides combine theirs. And so you've got West Berlin and East Berlin. What happens, though, is that there are a lot of people that don't like living under communist rule, and so a lot of people would jump the border and go into West Berlin. And then once they're in West Berlin, this is Western territory. And so they are now on free soil, so to speak, and they can then take some of these routes to get to West Germany without interference from the Soviets or East German officials. So many people did this over time that the Soviets started to get really irritated, and they decided they wanted to just take all of Berlin. And so the Soviets cut all of these roads and air corridors and all of that to try to prevent basically brain drain from people from East Berlin getting into West Berlin and then jumping out to Western Europe. And so the Berlin airlift was this successful attempt over a 9-10 month time span, where the Americans and others dropped supplies from the air into West Berlin to help to withstand the Soviet siege. And it worked. Eventually the Soviets backed down, and those travel routes were reinstated. But the Soviets are very ticked off about this, and it shows that there's a very real potential for conflict to Americans here. Now, 1949 is when we kind of get to the turning point, as I'm putting it here. In April, all those Western powers decided to form a military alliance against the Soviet Union. This is a big deal because the world had been kind of wary of alliances ever since World War I, because World War I had been the result of the alliance system gone amok, and so there was a lot of fear of that happening again. But the fear of the Soviet Union kind of outweighed the fear of potential disaster from alliances. So the Americans and the Western Europeans all joined together in this military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So now we have a militarized East versus West. That Iron Curtain is now a military boundary because you've got this military alliance of NATO versus the Soviet Union. The Soviets in 1958, I think it is, will respond with the Warsaw Pact, which is basically all those Soviet-controlled countries having a military alliance. That's kind of a technicality, though. That really existed before that point. It's basically East versus West as of the formation of NATO in April of 49. So this is kind of the final icing on the militarization cake, if you want to put it that way. That year, though, also becomes a bit troublesome for the West because in September, the Soviets light off their own atomic bomb. The Americans now no longer have a monopoly on the atomic bomb, and that is troublesome for the U.S. The U.S. had always kind of, comforted itself with the knowledge that, even if the Soviets get super powerful, they've got a massive military and all of that, we still have the bomb. At least we have that over them. That's no longer the case after September 23rd of 49, when they let off their own bomb. Now, the Soviets got their bomb basically because they had infiltrated the American and Manhattan Project, so they had been fully aware of the bomb's development back during World War II. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hadn't surprised any Russians at all. They knew it was coming eventually. And so the Soviets were able to basically steal plans from the U.S., and they built their own atomic bomb. Either way, regardless of how they got it. And that causes some heartburn for the West and for NATO because they no longer have control over, or sole control over atomic power. And then, barely a week later, maybe 8 or 9 days later, China falls to the communists. China had been in a civil war since the turn of the century between nationalists who were pro-West versus communists who were pro-communist. And in 1949, on October 1st, the communist forces finally won that 40-year-long civil war. So from the American perspective, this is a very big deal because within the span of a week or so, the country with the largest land mass, which is Russia, Soviet Union, and the country with the largest population in the world, which is China, are now communist. And again, there are some very big differences between Chinese and Soviet communism, which we don't need to get into right now, but there's some huge differences, which is eventually going to end in warfare. But from the American perspective, oh my God, that whole chunk of the world is now red. And they're not just red, they also own atomic bombs, so oh my God, the sky is falling. Which leads the U.S. to start looking for a new formulation of containment, because obviously containment just failed big time. We failed to prevent the containment of nuclear technology to the West. We failed to prevent the fall of China to communism, so wow, containment obviously needs a shot in the arm because that did not work very well. And the U.S., the National Security Council, which is one of those new organizations created under the National Security Act, creates a new kind of view of containment in this document known as NSC 68, which became kind of the foundation document for America's containment policies from 1950 onward when this was created. And again, there's this assessment of Soviet intentions and capabilities, which is pretty much identical to what Kennan's telegram was back in 1946. The Soviets intend to take over the world, and the capabilities, yeah, they have the capability to take over the world. They've got a huge military. They've got the atomic bombs now, and so we're going to have to go to possibly extreme measures to stop that. NSC 68 proposed a lot of changes to the American system to try to counter the Soviet threat. We're going to triple our defense spending. We're going to expand the military budget. We're going to develop a new generation of hydrogen bombs, which are more powerful than the atomic bombs. We're going to pump more aid to our allies, and there's going to be no detente. We're not going to cooperate with them in anything. We're going to fight them every way we can. It's going to be hugely expensive. They're basically talking about taking money from domestic programs like, Social Security, Medicare, that type of, not Medicare, that didn't exist, but, Social Security and other welfare type agencies. We want to take all those domestic spending that we can and shift it towards the military because we have to pump up our military capabilities. We have to pump up our new weapon systems. We need to do this to be able to defeat the Soviet Union. And this was a big deal. This was hugely influential among policymakers. It was classified, so no one outside of the government knew of it, but it was hugely influential within the government. A lot of these ideas never became reality because, the realities of politics and all of that. But the idea that the U.S. government is embracing this idea that we have to militarize even more is important. And it's going to be hugely important as we move on. But basically, to end here, I want to just talk about kind of the very basic American view of this new Cold War. And a lot of these ideas come directly out of NSC 68. A lot of them have been percolating for a long time before, but NSC 68 kind of makes it clear that this is the American perception of the Cold War. America's intentions are always good because we are a free society, we are a democratic society, we are governed by the rule of law, we are not governed by arbitrary whim of a dictator, we are not governed by, a powerful centralized command economy. We are a free people. Our intentions are always good. Our enemies' intentions are always bad because they are evil. They are, they're not a free society. They have the command economy and all of that. So America's enemies' intentions are bad, while Americans are always good. Communism, of course, is bad. Communism is always going to be aggressive and expansive. I've mentioned this a couple times now. It's always going to be aggressive and expansive, and so therefore America needs to stop that expansion any way they can. Appeasement is bad. Appeasement had brought about World War II. If the British hadn't appeased Hitler in Munich in 1938, maybe the war wouldn't have happened. Maybe if Britain had taken a stronger stance and had maybe somehow stood up to Hitler rather than appeasing him, maybe the war would have turned out differently. And so the lesson coming out of World War II, one of the big lessons to politicians anyway, is that appeasement is always bad. Never give in. That's weakness. That gives something for the enemy to exploit. However, all-out war against communism is impossible because, again, they have atomic bombs. They've got a huge military. So the Americans, probably would not be able to survive a direct all-out war against the Soviet Union. Which means that all of this stuff, communism is bad, our enemies are bad, we are good, any of the manifestations of that are going to have to be subtle. They're going to have to be as non-violent as possible because they have the possibility of escalating into something bigger. From the American perspective, again, the expansive nature of communism, the fall of one country threatens all, which means we have to interfere every time. We can't let one more country fall. We already let China fall, and that's a disaster. Russia, China, and other countries may fall, and that's just going to be that's a bad deal. So, and then the other kind of axioms here is that communists, there are no restraints. Communists are evil. They will do anything they can to win. Their leaders are not beholden to their people. In the U.S., we have restraints. Our politicians are beholden to the voters. If the voters don't like the politician's policies, we vote them out. So there is accountability in the United States. We have restraints. Communists do not have restraints. Now, the flip side to that is that a lot of people start to worry that our restraints in the U.S. might be too restraining, if you know what I mean. And so we're going to see examples over the next few weeks of times when the U.S. kind of discards a lot of its restraints and kind of the things that we like about ourselves in pursuit of this fight against communism and all of that. So that is all to come. This is my introduction to communism and the origins of the Cold War and all that. I hope this made sense to you. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I will see you online. Thanks, everybody, and I will see you next time.